Vorrei, fra poco parlerà e sarà l'organizzazione del 7 ottobre, parlerà Stefano Parisi. Io come padrone di casa voglio naturalmente darvi il benvenuto, ma voglio dire una cosa, dato che ci sono dei giornalisti in sala. La sensazione terribile che ho avuto sfilando con la brigata ebraica, che per poter esistere ha dovuto ringraziare la polizia a destra e a sinistra con degli scudi armati per proteggerci. Io penso che la stessa disagio, lo stesso dolore, lo stesso fastidio, la stessa preoccupazione ce l'ho adesso come Teatro Franco Parenti, che dando spazio a un dibattito interessante, di approfondimenti, di idee, per capire quello che sta succedendo, per capire come se ne può uscire, quali sono le soluzioni, si debba di nuovo essere protetti. Tutta la via Pierlombardo chiusa. E allora io voglio dire che se ci sono idee diverse, non una partita di calcio se io tifo per il Milan o per l'Inter, se ci sono idee da esprimere, il palcoscenico del Teatro Franco Parenti è aperto, lo si chieda e vengano a esprimere idee, non provocazioni, idee, perché siamo ancora un popolo che sa pensare e attraverso delle informazioni può farsi un giudizio, per cui che lo si dica, che domani lo sappiano tutti, questo palcoscenico è a disposizione, dietro c'è il mio spettacolo, bisognerà far presto perché poi il pubblico deve entrare a vederlo, non lascio mai vedere la mia scena alle altre cose, di solito metto i neri, ma in questo caso sono molto orgogliosa che qui dentro entri 7 ottobre.
Buonasera, buonasera, grazie per essere qui, grazie a tutti per essere venuti, grazie a Hillel, grazie a Rawan, grazie a Eylon, grazie per questo importante momento di ascolto della verità di quello che accade in questo conflitto. Grazie innanzitutto ad André e grazie per averci prestato questo teatro. Il Teatro Franco Parenti è da sempre un presidio di cultura, della cultura liberale di Milano. È un grande momento di sviluppo e proprio di sostegno dei valori democratici e liberali. La cultura è la base della nostra libertà. E il fatto che sia sotto attacco oggi, in questo momento, perché centro, non so, di propaganda sionista, è molto grave. L'ha già detto prima Andrei, il fatto che noi si faccia questa discussione protetti dalla polizia è una cosa gravissima che non dovrebbe succedere e ci deve far riflettere su quello che sta succedendo. Sappiamo che questi movimenti sono movimenti fatti da quattro gatti, poche persone, pochi studenti infiltrati da terroristi, lo sappiamo, ne abbiamo le prove, probabilmente finanziati anche da chi finanzia anche il terrorismo, ma hanno un grandissimo rilievo sui nostri media, hanno un grandissimo ossequio da parte degli accademici e anche la politica ha un po' paura di loro. E allora noi dobbiamo invece affermare i nostri valori. 7 ottobre, lo sapete, è nata non solo per difendere Israele, ma è nata per difendere i valori democratici, i valori liberali che vediamo in questo momento così sotto attacco. Dopo il 7 ottobre aumenta l'antisemitismo e si basa su questo odio verso l'Occidente che è profondo nella nostra società, che ha radici storiche lunghe, che ha creato un cambiamento di clima culturale, come Jonathan Sachs ha scritto nei suoi bellissimi libri. Ecco, io penso che noi di questo dobbiamo occuparci, per questo abbiamo voluto fare questo evento dove 3 combattenti sulla verità, loro combattono veramente per affermare la verità, per contrastare la propaganda che così tanto peso e tanto rilievo trova nella cultura occidentale. Ecco, dobbiamo sostenerli, dobbiamo ascoltarli e dobbiamo soprattutto diffondere. Loro dicono cose provate, parlano in modo coraggioso nel loro mondo, loro rischiano davvero, non quanto noi non rischiamo nulla, loro rischiano davvero giorno per quello che fanno. E il fatto che oggi siano qui con noi è molto importante, è un grande sforzo che noi abbiamo fatto, anche organizzativo, e grazie a voi davvero per essere venuti. Ecco, noi siamo molto preoccupati di questo, siamo preoccupati perché non ci rendiamo conto che il 7 ottobre non è stato solo un attacco a Israele, è stato un attacco all'Occidente. E questo attacco continua e il problema della guerra in Israele non si risolve lì. Se noi non siamo a fianco a Israele fino in fondo, se noi non vinciamo quella guerra, se noi non facciamo in modo che Israele prevalga, perché dobbiamo prevalere anche noi e la nostra cultura non deve essere sommersa, noi saremo travolti. Dopo gli ebrei che vivono e gli israeliani che vivono in Israele ci siamo noi nella loro lista di guerra. E quella cultura di odio e quella cultura di morte che sta purtroppo prendendo piede anche nel nostro Occidente pigro, rilassato, che non combatte per la libertà perché non ha più combattuto per la libertà da 78 anni. Mentre invece abbiamo dei ragazzi giovani, coetanei di quei ragazzi che qua fuori stanno facendo quel presidio e che vanno a morire a Gaza per la nostra libertà, non soltanto per la libertà di Israele. E l'Occidente pigro, remissivo, che lascia che il Qatar, che chi finanzia oggi i terroristi finanzia le nostre università, finanzia lo sviluppo delle nostre città, finanzia il nostro calcio, sia così presente in modo potente dentro i social network che sono di proprietà di ricchi occidentali, che non gliene frega nulla di quello che succede in futuro all'Occidente, gli interessa soltanto di valorizzare i loro asset per i quali loro hanno stravolto e cambiato la comunicazione nel mondo. Questo Occidente, se risponde in questo modo a quella guerra che è la nostra guerra, non è la guerra soltanto di Israele, diviso com'è diviso, con l'Europa che balbetta, che è divisa, per cui addirittura abbiamo i paesi che riconoscono la Palestina, altri che non la riconoscono, altri che pensano di sostenere le organizzazioni che stanno oggi accusando Israele di genocidio, lasciando invece che su Hamas non si dica niente. Ecco, noi di questo dobbiamo occuparci. O l'Occidente apre gli occhi, o se l'Occidente non apre gli occhi saremo sconfitti anche noi e arriveranno fino a qui. Noi di questo dobbiamo occuparci. E quindi io davvero vi ringrazio per essere venuti in tanti, vi ringrazio perché tanti di voi ci stanno seguendo in streaming, ringrazio veramente di nuovo tutti quanti e do finalmente la parola a Cristian Rocca che ci guiderà in questa giornata.
Grazie Stefano, ovviamente grazie Andrea della sua disponibilità di averci dato il teatro. Prima di raccontarvi come si svolgerà la serata e di presentarvi gli ospiti, mi prendo 2 minuti esatti per introdurre il dibattito. La cosa che a me più preme in questa narrazione del conflitto in corso, una narrazione che è incredibile, una narrazione che è surreale, gonfia di un antisemitismo militante che in Occidente non si avvertiva da un secolo, no? La cosa che mi colpisce di più è la sovrapposizione di 2 piani di racconto che sono completamente diversi e che dovrebbero rimanere completamente diversi, anziché essere invece confusi e continuamente contrapposti come lo sono oggi. Il primo piano è quello delle critiche al governo Netanyahu, lo scetticismo sulla sua strategia militare o politica, la disperazione per le migliaia di morti nell'operazione a Gaza, morti che sono morti palestinesi ma sono anche morti israeliani. Ieri è morto anche un italo-israeliano, non a Gaza ma nella parte nord del paese, che serviva nell'IDF, per non parlare ovviamente degli ostaggi che non si riescono a liberare. L'altro piano è quello della messa in discussione dello Stato di Israele, la sua esistenza, la sua incolumità, la sua legittimità, la sua cancellazione dalle cartine geografiche, dal fiume al mare. Stanotte, come sapete, ci sono stati altri missili contro una scuola dell'agenzia di rifugiati palestinesi delle Nazioni Unite, che per Israele invece era un luogo che era stato trasformato in un rifugio di Hamas. Ma il racconto della guerra, le critiche eventuali a Netanyahu e ad alcuni suoi alleati più estremisti, che peraltro sono il cuore in questo momento e da molto tempo del dibattito, il cuore pulsante del dibattito pubblico in Israele, sono diventati improvvisamente argomenti per delegittimare l'esistenza stessa di Israele. L'arma finale della propaganda islamista, secondo cui la rivoluzione sciita o lo Stato islamico, a seconda di chi parla, deve conquistare Israele, che deve conquistare Gerusalemme e sterminare tutti gli ebrei. Questi argomenti sono diventati anche da noi in Occidente l'occasione di una rivincita delle forze anticapitaliste contro l'Occidente, come diceva Stefano, contro il mondo libero e contro il suo avamposto ebraico. Tutto questo, va detto chiaramente, è inaccettabile, perché criticare il governo Netanyahu è legittimo, in alcuni casi anche doveroso, ma confondere questa critica con il diritto all'esistenza di un popolo libero e il diritto all'esistenza di uno Stato democratico è osceno. Non ci sono altri aggettivi. E se volete, questo sì è motivato da un intento genocida. Quindi adesso vi racconto come si svolgerà la serata. Chiamerò sul palco uno per volta i nostri ospiti, che parleranno per una ventina di minuti, poi resteranno sul palco, poi alla fine vediamo se c'è ancora tempo per chiudere con un finale che vedremo, che improvviseremo sul momento. Gli ospiti parleranno in inglese, ma siamo a Milano, qui tutte queste call per meeting, per fare budget e forecast, tutto sommato dovremmo sapere che cosa l'inglese, ma in ogni caso nella sua infinita bontà l'associazione 7 ottobre ha previsto una traduzione in italiano con l'intelligenza artificiale, che Dio ce la mandi buona. Prego gli ospiti di parlare poi in modo chiaro e non veloce. I will advise our guests to speak with a clear tone of voice and not very fast, because AI is intelligent, but up to a point. E quindi diciamo cominciamo con il primo ospite. Il primo ospite è un avvocato internazionale che si occupa di diritto internazionale, uno scrittore, è il direttore esecutivo di UN Watch, un'organizzazione per i diritti umani a Ginevra, in Svizzera. È stato definito uno dei 100 ebrei più influenti del mondo, è spesso ospite nei talk show, quelli veri, non quelli nostri, su CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. È considerato uno dei principali sostenitori dei diritti umani nel mondo e per questo è un uomo molto temuto dai dittatori in tutto il mondo, tanto che lo chiamano anche poi l'uomo che fa tremare l'ONU, e quindi ci parlerà soprattutto della verità sull'ONU. Benvenuto, please welcome Hillel Neuer.
Grazie mille. That's the end of my Italian. So, my friends know that I like to think I speak Italian, and I know 11 words, but I say each one with a lot of gusto. Now, first, I would like to thank you all for the very kind and warm reception. It's good to see some old friends from different parts of the world who've actually come. Some people have taken a plane from long, faraway places. People have come from Torino, another place from Rome. So thank you all for the really wonderful, warm reception. I'll be honest with you. I'm coming here from Geneva, from the United Nations Human Rights Council, and some of you who may have seen the appearances that I have there will know that when I walk in the room there, I get a very different kind of reception. So if looks could kill, I'd be dead 1,000 times. I've been there for 20 years, and I think no one has ever been more interrupted and cut off and targeted than me, unfortunately. Okay, so let me just say two things before we begin. First, it's really great to be here in the beautiful city of Milano, in the beautiful country of Italy. Great to be here. And I want to thank the organizers for Sette Ottobre, a very important organization. We're living in a very difficult time, not only for Israel and the Jews, but really for everyone. Very strange things are happening in our society. We don't know if we're being targeted by Chinese misinformation, maybe on TikTok, Russian corruption of politicians. Now we have the latest in Brussels. There's Russiagate, that Russia was bribing politicians and maybe journalists. We had last year Qatargate, where Qatar was paying off members of the European Parliament. So we're in a strange time where dictatorships and human rights abusers are trying to infiltrate in certain ways our political system and our public opinion. It's a very strange time, and we see these movements popping up in our universities that seem to be attacking some of the foundations of our democratic society. It's a very difficult time. I'm here to talk about how the United Nations plays into this. And as you know, I'm directing an organization, UN Watch, that monitors the United Nations, that tries to speak out for human rights, that is opposing anti-Semitism. And I'll share with you some of my thoughts on how things have been going when it comes to these subjects in the past several months, the past year. So, you know, when October 7th happened, there were a few world leaders who immediately responded to acknowledge the barbarism that had taken place. President Biden famously spoke about an evil that has been unleashed upon the world. Prime Minister Sunak from England said that, spoke about the pogrom that had taken place on that day. And, you know, at the United Nations, we recently marked and celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in that document, adopted in 1948, December 10th, 1948, in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. I don't think AI can translate Palais de Chaillot, but it was a special meeting of the General Assembly in Paris. They adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, speaking about the rights of equality and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to life, and other basic freedoms. And that document was adopted in 1948. That's a few years after the Holocaust, and that's not an accident. In the preamble of the declaration, it is written, this declaration is being adopted, I quote, in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. That was the motivation, the Nazi atrocities that motivated the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we have a right to expect that the United Nations, the guardian of the Universal Declaration, would be at the forefront in responding to barbarous acts which took place in our time, perhaps one of the worst terrorist attacks in modern times, mass rape, murder of 1,200 people in one day, horrific atrocities done before family members, terrible things. But sadly, too many leading United Nations officials and United Nations agencies and organs failed to speak clearly about what had taken place, even the opposite. For example, most famously, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, gave a speech several months ago where he said, yeah, I condemn what Hamas did, but he said, we must, of course, remember that nothing takes place, nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and he went on to enumerate numerous supposed Palestinian grievances against Israel, one after the other and the other. In effect, he was justifying what Hamas did. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Of course, he wasn't completely wrong, because nothing we do ever happens in a vacuum. We're all influenced by our families, our community, our education. He might have asked, nothing happens in a vacuum. What schools did the 3,000 terrorists who invaded Israel and massacred families, what schools did they go to? And had he brought some introspection, he would have acknowledged that the vast majority, maybe 90% of them, according to a UN official, went to UNRWA schools, to United Nations schools. The terrorists went to United Nations schools. Why is our money? Because it's the Western world that is paying for an agency that sadly, for 75 years, has been teaching young Palestinians, year after year, generation after generation, that your home is not here in Gaza. You know, Gaza is actually a very beautiful beach. I was there many years ago, and we gave them billions of dollars. They could have built up like Dubai, which builds up and looks to the future, but instead they took the money and they built down. They took the cement given to build homes, hospitals, and schools, and they used that cement to build terror tunnels, because they were told by UNRWA for generations that your home is not here in Gaza. You can see a video. The teacher asks the young student who's 10 years old, is your home here in Gaza? La. Where's your home? Jaffa, Akka, Haifa. They are told your home is in Israel, and the way you get it is the right of return, which for them means dismantling Israel. You can see video, little children, 5 years old, holding guns, fake guns, saying, right of return, right of return. So the UN, the right of return, a human right. No, there's no right to dismantle Israel. So all the money we gave to Gaza, the Western world, could have gone to build a beautiful place in Gaza. It could have been Tel Aviv 2.0. It's barely an hour from Tel Aviv. It's the same beach. Beautiful beaches, even nicer. Could have built Dubai, could have built Nice. but they're told by UNRWA that your home is not here, your home is there, and so they built hundreds of kilometers of terror tunnels. This was the project of UNRWA. Okay, that's the Secretary General. We can look at, and he set a tone, sadly, and he's not someone who was the most anti-Israel person. He was never very balanced. If you agree to become the head of that organization, which has, who are the shareholders? 56 countries are Muslim countries: Iran, Syria, Pakistan, Libya, and so on. So, of course, when you become head of that organization, you know who the shareholders are, and you will not get a Secretary General who is very balanced. But sadly, since October 7th, it got much worse. Very sad to see. We can look at the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, who was very close with China. You know, during the coronavirus, he didn't want to disagree with China, whatever China was telling him. They supported his campaign to become director. He is routinely the head of the health organization, World Health, routinely condemning Israel for allegedly attacking hospitals. What he doesn't say is that Hamas has made hospitals one of their main headquarters. Every hospital in Gaza has somewhere in there with terrorists hiding there. The Hamas terrorists are violating the Geneva Convention's international humanitarian law by exploiting, abusing a protected space of a hospital. They are putting at risk the patients in the hospital, the civilians in the area. Israel has to remove the terrorists. He should be speaking the truth and condemning Hamas. He should be condemning the arsonist, not the firefighter. The one who's lighting the fire, not the one who's putting out the fire. That's the World Health Organization. And then let's come, since we're still in Geneva, we have the UN Human Rights Council. It sounds very nice. The United Nations Human Rights Council. Most people here in Europe, even in my original country, Canada, I live in Switzerland, but originally in Canada, when you say to most people, the United Nations Human Rights Council, they imagine wise men with long white beards, dressed in white robes, strolling along Mount Olympus, making their decisions based on facts, logic, and morality. When nothing could be further from the truth. When those sitting around the table in Geneva, across the street from me, at the United Nations Human Rights Council, are not Plato, Socrates, or Aristotle, but for many years, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, who was chair in 2003, the Chinese communist regime, always on the Human Rights Council, the Cuban dictatorship of Fidel Castro and his successors, always on the Human Rights Council. Today, the members include current members: China, Cuba, Qatar, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Russia. Putin was always a member. We led the campaign to expel Russia. Only when he invaded Ukraine, it worked. America did it, and everyone voted. Enough voted. Venezuela, always a member up until a year or two ago. Chavez, Maduro, Venezuela. 7 million people fled the country because it collapsed. And we have some people from Latin America. They know very well what's happening in Venezuela. A regular member, a judge of human rights for the world. So, our organization tries to give a voice to the voiceless. When the dictators, the human rights abusers, the murderers are elected to top bodies, and I didn't mention, of course, in October, they elected the Islamic regime in Iran to be chair of the United Nations Human Rights Council Social Forum. The Human Rights Council Social Forum, Islamic regime of Iran, which is beating, blinding, poisoning, gassing, arresting, raping, torturing their own people. Women who rose up to demand women life freedom, and the men who joined them, who put their lives at risk, hundreds were massacred, thousands were arrested, maybe 20,000 were arrested. People are being executed. A rapper, a musician, Tumaj, is sentenced to death. We're calling for his release. This is the Islamic regime in Iran. Our organization, UN Watch, organizes every year the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. We just organized the 16th annual summit for human rights and democracy. We bring the victims. When China, Cuba, Iran are sitting in the seats as the judges of human rights, we bring their victims to speak to Geneva inside the United Nations. We just brought Ray Cha, who is a Chinese woman, young woman, very young woman, who stood up in Shanghai and did this. A white paper. She lifted the white paper. She was part of the white paper protest movement. They took her away right away, threw her in solitary confinement. She was thrown in prison, suffering. We brought her to speak. China sits there as a judge of human rights. We brought Ray Cha. She came and lifted up the white paper. That white paper was a mirror for the dictatorship. Let them see who they really are. And, you know, we may ask, China is 1.5 billion people, a fifth of humanity denied any freedom, no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of assembly. The Dr. Li Wenliang, who spoke about the coronavirus in Wuhan, he warned the world. They took him away in the middle of the night. He was gone. He was dead days later. The people in Hong Kong who had a beacon of freedom and democracy, it's extinguished. Tibetans, thousands of temples destroyed. You would think the United Nations Human Rights Council would speak for China. In the full history of the council, since 2006, so we're now 18 years, there has not been a single resolution, not one, on the UN, on China, at the UN Human Rights Council. Not one resolution. Instead, the vast majority are against Israel. In fact, there are more resolutions against Israel than on Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined. More resolutions on Israel than any other country. There are 2 agenda items. We're going to begin in Geneva in about a week or 2 weeks. There's going to be another meeting of the UN Human Rights Council. One day, one agenda item is on the world, human rights situations around the world for 193 countries. Another day, a special agenda item called human rights violations in occupied Arab territories, including Palestine, meaning Israel. One agenda item for the whole world, one against Israel alone. No other country, not Syria, where they are barrel bombing hospitals, where he's killed 500,000 of his own people, Assad, no agenda item. Not North Korea, one of the most horrific places on the planet, which sits across the street at the World Health Organization Executive Board. Elected last year to the executive board, the worst health system on the planet. And the UN is paying business class flights for the North Korean regime to send people to Geneva to attend these meetings. Not Russia, which is murdering innocent people in Ukraine. There's no agenda item on any of these countries, only Israel every meeting. So this is the reality. We held a real summit on human rights. We had for many years, she just stepped down to spend time with her family, an amazing Shayla, our organizer. Are Shayla's parents here? Do I see Shayla's parents here in the audience somewhere? Can you clap if you're here? Shayla's parents? I think they're here somewhere. But I want to thank Shayla Raka, who was our organizer, and to thank her parents, who I think are somewhere here. So it's an amazing event, and we bring Uyghurs. We brought the Uyghur Muslims. You know, 1 million or 2 million Uyghur Muslims are put in camps. They are persecuted. According to many countries, it's genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. Never a single resolution. How come the Human Rights Council, if they care about human rights, don't do one resolution for 1.5 billion people? If, you say, the activists on university campuses, if they care about human rights, why don't they go protest in every Walmart store? If you go into a Walmart store in America, and I'm sure here in Europe, in different stores, 90% of the products are made in China. Does anyone protest this? I don't see any universities caring about what happens in China. You could say, well, many of the protesters are Muslims. They care about their Muslim brothers. Really? They care about their Muslim brothers? For more than 10 years, I am bringing, with UN Watch and our coalition of 25 human rights groups, we are bringing Uyghur Muslims to speak about what they've been doing to them. I've never seen one student group in the world, other than the very select groups that care about Uyghurs or very small groups, but all these campus students, I've never seen one of them do an occupation of a university in Milano or Geneva, which they just did, to speak out for the millions of Muslim Uyghurs who have their beards cut off, who are forced to eat pork, and to crush their language and crush their religion. So we brought Abdoueli Ayoub, who was thrown into prison because he was defending his language and culture. So that's what we're facing at the Human Rights Council. And of course, Iran, we brought Dr. Kylie Moore Gilbert, an Australian scholar thrown into prison as a hostage. Iran takes hostages just like Hamas, their client, does. Okay. Speaking about the Human Rights Council, I have to share something here in Italy about someone named, you may have heard of her, Francesca Albanese. Have you heard of her? Francesca Albanese. When she is the UN expert, the UN investigator, the special rapporteur on Palestine. Sadly, she's from Italy, but we know tonight there are many good people here who care about real human rights. Real human rights. Not the rights of Hamas, not the rights of terrorists. When she was nominated 2 years ago, we went to the council. We gave them a dossier, and we said, you are about to appoint someone who is the opposite of what an expert is supposed to be. Your rules at the United Nations say the expert must be objective. She is the opposite of objective when it comes to Palestinian-Israel issues. You couldn't find a single person in the world who is less objective and impartial than Francesca Albanese. And we gave them the documents and the facts. The fact that 10 years ago she wrote a Facebook post. She said, give money to UNRWA. She used to work for UNRWA. Give money to UNRWA. And she said, you know, in America, America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Not Zionism, America subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Overt anti-Semitism. She wrote this in public to raise money for UNRWA. And now she says she didn't mean it, she meant something else, she meant the Israel lobby. Let's trust people what they say. And we gave the UN the examples where for years she's been comparing Israelis to Nazis, where her husband did work for the PLO as an advisor. She didn't mention this on her application. They said, are you impartial? Yes. Any conflicts of interest? No. Really? No? Your husband worked for the Palestinian Authority? You don't say it. Anything in your background that might make you seem not objective? No. No. Unbelievable. But they appointed her, and then as expert, she went on to speak at a Hamas conference by video. She said, you have the right to resist. So a UN expert is telling a Hamas conference, you can see it on video, you have the right to resist. And she is justifying what, October 7th? President Macron of France said this was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, an obvious truth. She said, no. She said it's not against Jews, it's against Israeli oppression. And then she got condemned, the first UN expert in history to be condemned by France and to be condemned by Germany. No other UN expert in history. So that's Francesca Albanese. A few other things about her very briefly. We revealed that she had a recent trip. She went to Australia in November. It was a bit of a strange trip because UN expert on a region, if you're the UN expert on Sudan, you go to Sudan. If you're the UN expert on Haiti, you go to Haiti. The UN expert on Palestine, she goes to Australia. She goes to New Zealand. They're great countries. I'd love to go too. Maybe someone will sponsor me. But she got sponsored. According to the Australian, I'll give you the precise name of the group. It's called AFOPA, Australian Friends of Palestine. They said, we sponsored her visit to give the lecture. So a UN expert is not supposed to be sponsored by an outside group. It's in the rules, the code of conduct. And we filed a complaint just this week to the United Nations, Guterres. We said, here are these pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas lobby groups in Australia saying they sponsored her trip, they supported her trip. She's not supposed to take the money. So she said, no, the UN paid for it. The UN paid for it. Okay, the UN paid for it. Well, we looked at the list of UN visits for last year. She went in November 2023. And on the 2023 list of official UN visits, it's not listed. So maybe it wasn't an official UN visit. And if the UN did pay for it, why is the UN paying for the expert on Palestine to be flying to Australia, to give speeches for lobby groups, to go in New Zealand and to lobby a pension fund to divest from Israel? Is this what a UN investigator is supposed to do? It makes no sense. So we asked, can you please disclose, like any member of parliament, release your expenses? That's all we asked. Today, just now, because she knew I would be here and speaking before journalists who are here, and I met today, she said, oh, no, everything I did is fine, and everything is fine. We also revealed one other thing, which you may know about, because you know about her, is, and I'll finish in just a few minutes, a funny story happened about 2 weeks ago. There was an account on Twitter that's called Rabbi Linda Goldstein. Rabbi Linda Goldstein, it's a parody account, a satire account. It's Linda Goldstein says she's the chief rabbi of Gaza. There are no Jews in Gaza, okay? There were up until 2005. Chief rabbi of Gaza, and she's anti-Zionist. So join me, I'm a progressive anti-Zionist. I'm a rabbi who hates Israel. That's the satire parody account. Okay, but the account, the person who runs it, sent a letter, an email, to Albanese's office and said, please come to Columbia University. We have the Intifada at Columbia. Please come, please speak. And her office, her assistant answers, great, bravo, we want to come. And the office says, you said there'll be a payment, honorarium. How much? How much money you're going to pay? Because she's not allowed to accept, but you could send the money to me. I will send you an invoice. You send the money to me. So what a UN official cannot do directly to give a lecture for money, she cannot do indirectly by sending it to her assistant, Sarah Troyan, who I think is also Italian, but living in the Netherlands, and she's going to get an invoice. So we asked, if everything is kosher, if everything is good, I asked her now, moments ago, I wrote to her on Twitter, just release the information. Then if I'm wrong and I'm lying, release the information. Number one, all your expenses, who paid for it? The group that said they sponsored, the UN, release the information. So far, nothing. And if you're not taking payments, release the information about this institute that's giving invoices. So that is what we're demanding, is full disclosure. It's time for UN officials who support Hamas to be held to account. I will just wrap up by saying one more thing. I promised yesterday to make a revelation. I don't have much time, but just make one revelation. Francesca Albanese, not so well known, is leading a global network of anti-Israel officials, people who used to work for UNRWA, professors, about 50 of these people around the world, figuring out various ways to use law to attack Israel, to use the UN to attack Israel. They put out a document, which I obtained on the internet, which is a plan on how to get countries to give money to UNRWA, countries that froze their money. And she says, her friends, they put a document, a strategy. You need to send messages in Europe to how to convince people to give money. And one of her messages is, she says, tell countries, the governments, especially in Europe, the right-wing governments, tell them, if you don't give money to UNRWA, then the Arabs, the Palestinians, they're all going to come to Europe. 6 million, they're all going to come to Europe. So tell the right-wing governments they have to give money. Otherwise, they're all going to show up here. So what a cynical manipulation of public opinion, of lawmakers. And this was a strategy they developed to convince governments, among other things, to fund UNRWA. I'm just going to sum up by saying that what we're up against is very challenging. It's not only at the UN, as we'll hear. You know, on October 17th, the whole world had the headline, Israel bombs hospital, kills 500 people. The whole story was false. It wasn't Israel. It was the jihad that fired the rocket. It wasn't the hospital. It was the parking lot. They didn't kill 500 people. It was maybe 10, maybe 50. We don't know. It was all a lie. But the whole world, New York Times, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and of course, Albanese and the others, they all went with the story. It means that in the world, leading institutions want that story. They want that story. Israel kills innocent people. And here in Europe, we recall some of the history. When people were dying of the Black Plague, they said it's the Jews who poisoned the wells. this was all over here in Europe. So we're up against something very strong, but it's amazing to see the people here, and we're resolved to fight back against the enemies of human rights, the enemies of democracy, those who support terrorism. We're not going to give up. We're going to hold people like Albanese, Francesca to account, and with your help, we shall prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hillel. And also she is not a lawyer, according to the Italian law. We have here Professor Riccardo Puglisi, who actually outed her on Twitter. So thank you, Riccardo. Lo fai tu? Okay. Non so, sì. Ok, allora il secondo ospite è una militante siriano-libanese di nazionalità tedesca che si batte da tempo per la pace tra il mondo arabo e Israele. Ha fondato Arabs Ask ed è anche presidente di un'associazione che si chiama Post October 7. Stefano, lei è già andata oltre te, tu sei October 7, Post October 7. Ha documentato vari casi di persecuzione di attivisti, militanti, dissidenti politici nel mondo arabo che sostengono la normalizzazione dei rapporti con Israele. Ha organizzato vari tour di conferenze per promuovere gli accordi di Abramo. Lavora da tempo per la pace tra Israele e il mondo arabo. Benvenuta, Rawan Osman. Please welcome. Credo che lei abbia bisogno del leggio. Ecco cosa è successo. Is it okay for you?
Yes.
Is it stable? Maybe here? The other way? Non sono preparato.
Technical problem.
Ok. Please.
No. I just want it to be stable. If you want me to read my speech. Okay, seems to work. Hi, everyone. It's a privilege to be here, to be on this panel, and thank you to 7 Ottobre. I'll try to be as short as possible. This is why I said 15 minutes, because I know Hillel Neuer. But it's worth it. I'm really happy. It's a pleasure to listen to him. So, what do you want me to do?
Don't worry.
You'll take care of the mic? Thank you. So, as some of you know, I'm neither a lawyer nor an Israeli spokesperson. I'm an accidental activist, an angry mother who will not accept what happened on October 7th, and neither should you. I grew up in the Middle East. My father's family are Sunnis from Damascus. My mother's family are Shia from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And that is where I grew up, in the heartland of Hezbollah, if you know them. Although I grew up in a liberal, secular, middle class, in progressive Lebanon, not attending UNRWA schools, but a French Catholic school, there is nothing I hated more than Israel and the Jews. Bear with me, don't give me the looks. Just like my friends, just like everyone, we hated the Jews. Stay next to me.
It's okay. I think that now it's okay.
Hopefully. Thank you. And why wouldn't we hate the Jews? We are enemies. We are special enemies. Thank you. We don't speak to Israelis, ever. Many Arab countries have anti-normalization laws and policies forbidding people-to-people contact between their citizens and Israelis. In 2020, Kind al-Khatib, a Lebanese activist, received a tweet from an Israeli journalist. She had to appear in front of a military tribunal and was sentenced to 3 years in prison because of a tweet. Sarah Aidan, the former Miss Iraq, she took a selfie with Miss Israel during a beauty pageant in the US, I think. Her Iraqi nationality was revoked, unlike Iraqis who joined ISIS. She's the only Iraqi whose nationality was revoked. She lives in the US. These two examples should illustrate the non-existent dialogue with the Israelis. This is our reality. We don't know, we hate them to death. We don't argue with them. We go straight to war. We try to kill them. Sometimes we succeed. Then they hit back. And we hate them even more. Why can't their retaliation be proportionate? My memories go as follows. When they sent their Air Force to attack us, the buildings shake. The sound is horrific. Infrastructure is destroyed. Roads are cut. And we watch horrific images of civilian casualties on the news until we lose power. How can a child forget this? I remember the nights my sister and I would spend sleeping on a mattress in the kitchen pantry during air raids. Don't ask me why my parents thought that we would be safer in the pantry. They should know better. They also grew up in war. So did their parents. War is not fun. You hear my simple story, and if you are a kind person, you sympathize with me. Many have already concluded that Israel is nasty. Personally, I thought Hezbollah, and I'm not proud of this, were heroes protecting us from Israel, until I moved to Europe and had access to the Israeli narrative, the one omitted from our collective consciousness in the Arab world. The Lebanese society was mostly secular when I was born in the 80s. At first glance, the Lebanese come across as modern and European-minded. By that, I mean closer to the Western value system. But under the surface are the deep, open wounds of the Lebanese civil war. The Lebanese committed atrocities against each other, and hundreds of thousands lost their lives or their loved ones. The left blames it on Israel and the West. The right blames it on the PLO and their sympathizers in Lebanon and in the region. This is why we call it the Arab-Israeli and not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The biggest camp in the Arab world, the Pan-Arabists, the Islamists, the nationalists, the communists, the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the mullahs in Iran who disagree on almost everything, unite in agreement on one issue, the Palestinian cause being a central Arab cause. And so the Israelis are enemies of all the Arabs, not only the Palestinians. Why? Because the Arabs want justice for the Palestinians. And they want them to have the right for self-determination. Ladies and gentlemen, that is bullshit. The Iranian regime, as Hillel already mentioned, killed teenage girls when all they wanted is to feel air in their hair. And they silence any Iranian who opposes their backwardness. The Syrian regime, my regime, killed more than 500,000 Syrians, many more, but these are the documented deaths, and displaced more than half of the Syrian population. Hezbollah helped the Syrian regime kill the Syrians who called for a regime change. Hezbollah assassinates every prominent opponent in Lebanon. And last but not least, does Hamas want justice for the Palestinians? Or to give them the right for self-determination? They haven't had an election since 2007. Hamas did not consult with Gazans before bringing a war upon them. And want justice when they steal from their own people. And I won't repeat what Hillel already listed. The Arab world is not interested in justice, but in the demise of the state of Israel. Those who support the Palestinian resistance are not bothered by Palestinian suffering. They just want the Israelis to suffer enough to leave the Middle East once and for all. In the culture where I grew up, this is the public stance. I know what I'm talking about after having lived for 25 years in 4 Arab countries: Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Do you know what I mean when I say that the Israelis are our special enemies? For 25 years, I believed what I was taught, and I am one of the few who broke out of the system. My country, or countries, are still in an undetermined state of war. We are told that the Israelis are our enemies on TV, at school, at home. There aren't Jews among us. We know nothing about their traditions, their holidays, their language, but we know their story, their truth. But how do we know their story although we never spoke to them? Well, we tell their story for them. We tell it to children at school, in history classes. In other words, the state tells their story. And it goes as follows. The Jews are Europeans who came to the Middle East to colonize Palestine. Simple. It was the idea of the Zionist called Theodor Herzl, the antagonist in the story. Initially, the Jews succeeded, which led to the misery of the Palestinian people, obviously. And the inevitable happy ending would be returning Palestine to its people. Simple story. The story told this way to children implies that Palestine was a country and that the Jews are alien to the region. These are not the only historical distortions systematically spread to brainwash generation after generation. In the Arab world, we forget that nearly 700,000 Jews had to leave the Arab world, leaving behind their memories, their roots, but also their possessions and assets and properties. We were told that they left because Israel wanted them to. Although they were living happily with Arabs, I dare to challenge that notion. Please look up the Farhud pogrom. It happened in Baghdad in 1941. The Aleppo Codex is one of the most important and oldest well-kept Hebrew religious texts in Judaism, and it was damaged and almost lost in a fire during riots incited against the Jewish communities in Aleppo, Syria. The riots were incited by the Syrian authorities in 1947, when they learned about the UN partition plan. Jews were targeted before founding the State of Israel. The Nazis were defeated in Europe, but their ideology vis-à-vis the Jews, at least, carries on among Arabs. If they could, the Arabs would deliver their promise and wipe Israel off the face of planet Earth. But unlike during the Second World War, now Israel has a powerful army. The Jews learned their lesson, and they were reminded on October 7th to never ever let their guard down again. The question is, when will you in Europe learn your lesson? When will the rest of the world understand the growing influence of the Iranian regime, because of which a catastrophic cultural, intellectual, and economic decline started, and it continues steadily since Khomeini took over Iran in 1979? The axis of resistance led by Iran and through its proxies in the Middle East, namely the Syrian regime, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, declared an open war on Western civilization on October 7th. This is not about Israel. This is a war between modernity and a backward cult of death. I am from the Middle East, and I'm telling you, the enemy is not Israel. The entire world ganged up against this tiny country, which against all odds and despite all wars, achieved wonders and excelled in every aspect. Why? Think about it this way. The world is a classroom, and it has one Jewish kid, and he is the achiever. He minds his own business and surpasses everybody's expectations, despite his modest means. Instead of rewarding and encouraging him or her, he's bullied non-stop. The supervisors who are supposed to intervene in his defense are siding with the bullies. This is our world today. Personally, I stand with the Jewish kid against the bullies. I proudly stand with Israel. Have you seen the knife attack in Mannheim in Germany last week? A 25-year-old Afghan stabbed 3 and a young policeman to death at an event criticizing Islam. Beware the wrath of Muslims if you ever dare criticize their religion. Do they have to keep reminding you? How can you forget 9/11 or Charlie Hebdo or the Bataclan massacre in Paris in 2015? I suspect that the world deliberately forgets in an attempt to sweep the problem under the carpet. The world doesn't know how to deal with terrorism. That's it. Israel is trying to. Israel is fighting Hamas in Gaza and might have to fight Hezbollah in the north. And the world is lecturing Israel on what to do and what not to do, as if the world knows better. I would like to leave you with this thought. If a 19-year-old Palestinian woman was dragged out of bed, half naked, beaten, raped, then pulled by the hair and paraded on the streets, filmed in her bloody pants, and shared on social media, what would the world do and what would Muslims do? Thank you.
Grazie, Rawan. Il terzo ospite è cofondatore di Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office, conduttore di un podcast molto seguito che si intitola State of a Nation. È stato portavoce del governo israeliano all'inizio della guerra del 7 ottobre con Hamas. È diventata una delle voci più rilevanti e influenti per la causa israeliana. In passato è stato anche consulente internazionale per i media del presidente israeliano Herzog, dopo una carriera da conduttore televisivo. Laurea ad Oxford e a Cambridge, e ha prestato servizio nell'IDF dopo aver fatto Aliyah dalla Gran Bretagna. Please welcome Eylon Levy. You need this?
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here in Milan for the first time. Normally when I go to work in Israel wearing this suit in the hot Mediterranean sun, I'm by far the most overdressed person on the street. And today I landed in a city where everyone is on their vintage Vespas in designer suits, and I feel underdressed. Tomorrow marks 8 months since the beginning of the October 7th war, 8 months since the darkest day in Israel's history, 8 months since the darkest day in Jewish history, since the chimneys of Europe were still churning. 8 months in which the world has had time to reflect on what is truly at stake in this war. What is truly at stake in Israel's longest war since the War of Independence, a war that many Israelis are calling their second war of independence. At stake, is it only the lives of the hostages still trapped in the Hamas terror dungeons? 125 people, over 40 of whom have been killed, who are being starved and tortured and raped and executed by the brutal terror organization that burned whole families alive on October 7th. At stake in this war, is it the right of Israeli families to sleep in their beds, of young Israelis to go to a music festival, to go for a bike ride, for a jog in the morning, and know that they will not be abducted by terrorists in terrorist-controlled territory just over the border and taken into a dark tunnel somewhere? At stake, is it the peace, prosperity, security, and existence of the state of Israel? Because this is not a local war between Israel and a Palestinian terrorist group in Gaza. This is a regional war in which Israel is fighting for its life against Iran and its proxy armies on 7 different fronts. Every moment, Israel is on high alert against the terrorists in Gaza who still hold hostages and are firing rockets at Israeli cities, against terrorists in the West Bank who continue to try to perpetrate attacks against Israelis, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has 150,000 missiles pointed at us, shooting them every single day, displacing 60,000 Israelis from their homes for 8 months. They are refugees in their own countries, because a terrorist army with the 8th largest missile stockpile in the world is shooting rockets at their homes and suicide drones to deliberately target civilians, and then the first responders who come to save them. That's 3 fronts. We also have attacks coming from Syria, from the Iranian militia in Iraq, from the Houthi pirates in Yemen, and from Iran itself. Just this week, we had a drone attack from Iraq that Israel had to shoot down. Iran's proxy army in Yemen fired a ballistic missile at Eilat that we had to intercept in space. Hezbollah set northern Israel on fire. 7 fronts, Iran and its proxy armies. At stake, perhaps, is it the peace and prosperity of the Jewish diaspora around the world? Because this is not a war on 7 fronts, it is a war on 8 fronts, where Jews around the world are being intimidated and harassed and threatened. Yes, here too in Europe. Yes, here too in Italy. There's a good reason that the evil supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, called the protesters on campuses a branch of the resistance front. He is saying they are the same as Hamas and Hezbollah. Because when they chant from the river to the sea, they don't mean they want one single, peaceful, secular democracy for all. They mean the violent destruction of the state of Israel. They know it and he knows it. When they chant globalize the intifada, They don't mean let's all resist in a nice, peaceful way. They mean targeted violence against Jews and Israelis and exporting terrorism across Europe and the West, and Israel has already helped Western governments prevent and foil terror attacks on their own soil. But I think that there is something so much greater at stake in this war, greater than the fate of Israel, greater than the fate of the Jews, greater than the fate of Europe. It's this question: does truth matter anymore? Do facts matter anymore? Does the law matter anymore? Because Hamas is not only waging a physical war against Israel, together with Iran and its proxy armies, it is waging an information war. A war of deliberate misinformation, a psyops campaign against Israel that is designed to poison global public opinion against the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, that is determined to delegitimize the Jewish state, make it a global pariah by spreading lie after lie after lie. And unfortunately, there is no lie so ridiculous that people will not believe it about Israel. There is a campaign underfoot now to paint the state of Israel, the Jewish and democratic state of Israel, as the new Nazi Germany. That is the meaning of the despicable campaign by South Africa, joined today by your neighbors in Spain, to accuse Israel of genocide. It is to say that the state of Israel, created as a safe haven for the Jews who survived the Holocaust, built by the Jews who were fortunate enough to get out of Europe before the Holocaust, which exists to ensure that a Holocaust can never happen again, is guilty of the same crimes as the Nazis. And that is a campaign that is supposed to make you, people in Europe, think that if the Jews are as bad as the Nazis, maybe the Nazis should have finished the job back in 1945. And if they didn't, and the Jews are as bad as the Nazis now, maybe we should. That is what is at stake with the despicable campaign by South Africa acting as the legal arm of Hamas to accuse Israel of genocide. A campaign to take a crime defined in the wake of the crimes that shock the conscience of mankind and to empty it of meaning. Because on October 7th, the people of Israel were the victims of an act of genocide. Hamas sent in its death squads with a view to murdering as many people as it could, as brutally as it could, and it would have killed many more than the 1,200 people it slaughtered in a single day if our men and women had not stopped them. It was a massacre committed with Nazi-like cruelty, Nazi-like efficiency, in the service of a Nazi-like ideology that seeks the destruction and murder of every Jew in the land of Israel and indeed around the world. South Africa is intervening as the legal arm of Hamas to try to save it from the consequences of the war that it started, a war that Israel did not want, did not start, did not expect, but is having to fight to bring back the hostages and make sure that never again means never again. South Africa is trying to save Hamas from the consequences of that campaign by turning Israel into a global pariah. Because when you paint it as Nazi Germany, all means are kosher. You do not negotiate with Nazis. You do not talk to them. You do not accommodate them. You eliminate them. And that is what Hamas, Iran, and its supporters around the world are trying to hoodwink the free world into doing to Israel. This is a war in which truth has been stripped of meaning. Hillel mentioned earlier the example from early October when an Islamic Jihad rocket shrapnel hit the car park of a hospital and killed a few dozen people. But Hamas sent out a press release saying that it was an Israeli airstrike on the hospital that flattened the building and killed 500 people. By the way, when you see Hamas's casualty counts, the numbers of people it claims have been killed in this war, they include the 500 people who did not die at that hospital. This is a war in which facts have no meaning, and at which the institutions we rely on as the free world, the institutions we rely on as the international community to be neutral arbiters, to uphold the international rules-based order, have been weaponized in the service of a violent ideology. In which when, as Hillel says, the World Health Organization cannot bring itself to condemn Hamas for waging war out of hospitals and blames Israel for going after Hamas in the hospitals, it seeks to redefine international law as saying that terrorists have immunity from attack if they hide in the basement of a hospital. And terrorists around the world are taking notes. In which UN officials tell Israel that it cannot attack Hamas targets in Hamas strongholds because civilians might get hurt. And then when Israel says that it will encourage civilians to get out of the way and buy tents at the expense of the Israeli taxpayer and create a humanitarian zone so that civilians can get out of Hamas strongholds and be protected, the same UN officials say, no, you cannot attack Hamas targets because then civilians will be displaced. They tell Israel it must protect civilians, and then they try to make it an internationally illegal move to protect them. Swooping in to save Hamas by saying if you hide behind enough civilians, you have immunity. And there is nothing that the professional army of a democratic state can do if you weaponize and exploit international law in that way. So many allegations, completely emptying words of meaning. The repulsive allegation of apartheid against Israel, a state in which 20% of its citizens are Arabs, full citizens of the country. They serve in its courts, its Supreme Court, its parliament, in its media. They are our doctors and nurses. I'll tell you a remarkable story. Just last week, I got in a taxi. An Arab Muslim taxi driver from East Jerusalem who told me with pride that he saved 2 girls from the Nova Festival. And that at 6:40 in the morning, he bundled them into the taxi, drove them away, his hands shaking on the wheel as he saw the paragliders coming in. And he tells me with pride, if Allah takes me tomorrow, I will die proud that I saved 2 girls from the Nova party. That is Israel. Allegations from UN officials that have picked a side, and make no doubt about it. Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization, Francesca, I'm sorry, she's one of yours, have picked a side and they want Hamas to win. The allegations that Gaza is on the brink of famine. They predicted there would be tens of thousands of people dying of starvation by now. The UN has not updated its numbers in a month. Why? Because Israel is facilitating unrestricted amounts of aid into the Gaza Strip. The number of aid trucks have gone up month by month. There is now far more food entering Gaza every day than there was before the war. And according to a recent academic study, enough food that it's 60% more than a woman's recommended daily allowance in calories. Food, Israel is flooding Gaza with aid, and the UN is drowning under it. Just yesterday, Israel released images of the contents of 1,000 trucks worth of humanitarian aid sitting inside the Gaza Strip, waiting for the UN to collect it. And instead of scaling up its operations and delivering that humanitarian aid, the responsible officials continue to repeat the lie that Israel is blocking aid from entering the Gaza Strip. Even as Egypt refused to let trucks leave El Arish and reach the Israeli crossing at Kerem Shalom, even as Hamas continued to shoot rockets and mortars at the Israeli crossings, killing 4 Israeli soldiers, even as Israel worked to facilitate aid into Gaza by air, land, and sea, the same UN officials continued to accuse Israel of choking off aid to Gaza because facts don't matter. What does it mean for you, for Europe, when the United Nations is covering up how Hamas has embedded itself in UN facilities? The attack overnight on a Hamas compound in a school in Gaza was the 5th Israeli airstrike on a Hamas compound in a UN facility just this month. Now, the head of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, is he also an Italian? Swiss, okay. I'll let you off for that one. Said these claims are shocking and we cannot verify them. He should not be shocked, because that is Hamas's modus operandi, to embed itself in civilian structures, in UN buildings, in UNRWA buildings, because it knows it will get away with it. Hamas built its intelligence headquarters in a tunnel 20 meters under UNRWA's main offices in Gaza that leached electricity from the offices above ground. And the UN claims with a straight face, maybe we left the television on the weekend and that's why the electricity bill was so high. You are suffering from this. Emptying words of meaning, twisting international law as a weapon to continue a military war against Israel, lets down not only us in Israel, and we have an army to protect us, it lets down not only the Palestinians as well, it lets down the whole world. It lets down the concept of an international rules-based order. Because if the rule is twisted into whatever makes sense to continue a war of propaganda and misinformation against Israel, then it is not a rule. And it is not justice. And that is not a world in which the values that we are committed to of international cooperation can truly exist. And that is why it is so important that Israel win this war. And why it needs its friends to speak loudly and clearly in favor of Israel's right to win this war. Not to call it to a draw, but to win. To win a war we did not want, we did not start, we did not expect, a war we wish we could wave a magic wand and make it go away, because every day we are losing soldiers who are either 18, 19-year-old kids fresh out of high school or reservists, people who on October 6th were planning their next vacation, planning a wedding, planning their next startup, and have found themselves now for 8 months, ordinary people, sitting in a tank, defending their country, putting on uniform, because that is what their country needs in order for the country to survive. We wish we could make this go away. But we know that if this war ends with Hamas still holding on to hostages, if this war ends with Hamas still in power in Gaza, there will be a next time, and it will be worse. And it will be worse because Hamas will think the lesson it will draw is that it won or called it a draw because the free world stepped in to save it. Because after seeing acts of gang rape and families burned alive to an ash, and babies, for God's sake, taken hostage. There is still a baby hostage in Gaza. The free world fell for a campaign of propaganda and misinformation spread by the likes of Iran and China and Russia, and decided to leave a terrorist entity on the doorstep of the only democracy in the Middle East. Many of your neighbors here in Europe fall into the same trap time and time again of thinking that they are doing good when they are doing things that make them feel good, but cause a huge amount of damage. The decision by the governments of Spain, Ireland, and Norway to recognize a non-existent Palestinian state in response to October 7th rewards Hamas for the barbaric violence of October 7th. And it incentivizes Hamas to do the same again, and it tells terrorists around the world, rape harder. Ireland, the government of Ireland, told Hamas that abducting Jewish babies is a good way to advance their national cause. The government of Norway told Hamas that raping Jewish women is a good way to advance its national cause. The government of Spain told Hamas that burning Jewish families alive is a good way to advance its national cause. And if we want to move beyond this conflict, with the hostages home and Hamas toppled from power, we need the Palestinians to learn that terrorism is a dead end. There is no light at the end of that tunnel. It does not pay. Because if this war ends with Hamas and Iran and their supporters believing that the free world fell for a vicious campaign of misinformation that emptied truth of meaning, that twisted law beyond recognition, that gave it rewards for conducting in the most savage terrorism this world has ever seen, then there will be a next time, it will be worse, and it will be the responsibility of those who stepped in to save Hamas instead of standing by Israel's side as it fought the fight of the whole free world. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and let's all hope for better days. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes left, so abbiamo 15 minuti per fare. I will start with Hillel with a double question for you. I can. Faccio una domanda a Hillel perché 20 anni fa io ho scritto un libro che si intitolava così leggermente Contro l'ONU e tra l'altro la sua organizzazione diciamo era stata una delle fonti più importanti per scrivere quel libro e la cosa più importante nel nel preparare quel libro è stata questa che era proprio riguardava Israele, due cose in particolare, il fatto che ci fossero due diverse agenzie per i rifugiati, una per tutto il mondo e una per Israele, con la bizzarria che la UNRWA è cominciata 70 anni fa con 700.000 rifugiati e adesso sono 6 milioni, quindi diciamo non si capisce qual è l'obiettivo di questa agenzia. I'll translate to you. Se sono partiti con 700.000 adesso sono 6 milioni. E poi il fatto che secondo le regole dell'ONU i paesi arabi non accettavano Israele nella loro gruppo regionale, quindi siccome l'ONU funzionava fino a poco tempo fa per gruppi regionali, sostanzialmente Israele non era un membro pieno delle Nazioni Unite e non poteva partecipare a nessun organismo, infatti non è mai stata per esempio nel Consiglio di sicurezza. Per cui gli vorrei chiedere perché questo. Why there are two different refugee organizations, one for the rest of the world and one for Israel, and for Palestine, and why I mean, what's the goal of the UNRWA? Because they started 70 years ago with 700,000 refugees, and now they are almost 6 million, right? And also, if you can explain how the UN used to work until a few years ago, because the Arab states didn't allow Israel to become part of the regional group, and so Israel wasn't a full member of the UN. Why this happened? What's your take on this?
Okay. So the first question about UNRWA, I'm glad you asked because I wanted to say more about UNRWA, but we were talking about our friend Francesca, and I thought for Italy it was a bit more important. But UNRWA is a very important subject. I spoke about it a little bit. It's important because UNRWA is running the schools, so it's teaching the next generation. And to say the obvious, if young children are being taught in schools that the only way to move forward as a Palestinian is to end Israel, to dismantle Israel, under the name of the right of return, we will never have peace. So that is UNRWA. I've had the privilege for the past 10 years to be reading what UNRWA teachers write. Very easy, go on Facebook, search for UNRWA, find teachers in Gaza, in Jordan, in Lebanon. And we heard from Rawan already about what is being taught in the Arab world. And in the UNRWA schools, teachers like Elham Mansour, a teacher in Lebanon 2 years ago, she wrote, in the name of Allah, we are obliged to kill every Jew, every Israeli. This is a religious obligation. She's a teacher for UNRWA in Lebanon. So, to answer your specific question, in Geneva, next to my office, is UNHCR, the UN agency for all refugees. If you are a Syrian refugee fleeing into Turkey, or Sudanese refugee, or from Ukraine, millions of people around the world have UNHCR to help them. And the goal of that agency is to make you not a refugee. And UNRWA is the opposite. Why did this happen? Briefly, it began with good intentions. America was one of the founders of UNRWA in 1949, 1950, to help Palestinians who fled the region during that time from the war. But very quickly, within a few years, the experts that they brought the leading experts of development and resettlement. The experts realized that the Palestinian beneficiaries didn't want to move on. They said, no, if we accept that we're going to be resettled here in Jordan or in Gaza or in Lebanon, then it means the war is over. And for us, the war is not over. So you had something perverse, something twisted that developed. Unlike the UN Agency for the World, which makes you not a refugee, okay, you are resettled somewhere, UNRWA is the opposite. They don't seek to find resettlement for Arabs who left from northern Israel, then it was called Palestine, into Lebanon. It's a very close distance, linguistically, language, religion, culture, very close. They could easily have been resettled years ago, but both the Palestinians themselves didn't want to acknowledge that the war is over and didn't want to acknowledge that the Jewish state has a right to exist. So they said, UNRWA must keep going, not resettle us, so you keep getting more generations of so-called refugees. And very important, UNRWA budget is about $1.5 billion. Qatar could pay for it in a moment. Wouldn't even notice it on their checkbook, on their bank account. They wouldn't even notice. But it's a decision they made in the Arab world and the pro-Palestinian world. We want the Western world to pay for it. The money is not the issue, it's the legitimacy. When you in Italy pay for UNRWA, and I understand that the money was renewed, not all of it, but some of it was reinstated. When Switzerland, where I live, which so far hasn't fully reinstated, Canada did reinstate. I'm ashamed. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, terrible disappointment. He's betrayed Canadian values by funding UNRWA. Even before they created a fake review to review how UNRWA works, it was all fake. It was, we say in French, truqué. It was fixed in advance. It was all fixed in advance. The head of the inquiry was someone who likes the agency. The three members, institutes from Scandinavia are all very close with the agency. One of them, this woman, Kjersti Berg, is a Danish, I think she's a Danish activist, was on the inquiry. She's part of Francesca Albanese's network of pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, how to save UNRWA. She was one of the groups that's doing the independent review. So it's all fixed. And sadly, Canada reinstated the money even before the fake review came out. So in short, the point of UNRWA, sadly, is to keep the war going. And as the Swiss foreign minister, who's from Ticino, so he's a neighbor of yours, Ignazio Cassis, he said the truth. In 2018, he visited Jordan. He saw but in Jordan, there's 2 million Jordanians who have Palestinian background. They have Jordanian citizenship. According to the UN, they're refugees. That means your job is to go back to Israel and dismantle Israel. He said, it's a perverse logic. He's the foreign minister of Switzerland. It's a perverse logic. We are perpetuating this refugees forever and ever, and it has to come to an end. I agree with the Swiss foreign minister very much. He got in trouble in Switzerland, so he kept quiet on that. But so far, the Swiss parliament, they invited me a few weeks ago to speak in Bern. And so far, the Swiss parliament has not yet approved the money, and I hope that they won't. America said no more funding for another year. I'm going to be in the parliament of the Netherlands in 2 weeks, and hopefully the same, we can convince them to support real peace, not an agency that perpetuates war.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes left. Rawan, if I may, I would like to ask you a personal question. When did you realize that the narrative about the Jewish people in which you were raised was false? I watched an interview you gave to, I guess, an Israeli television, saying that the first time you met, actually, a Jew, a couple of Jews, in Amsterdam, I guess. If you may, in Germany? In Strasbourg, okay. If you can tell us this, and also if you are... 3 is, I guess, too much. Yay. Too many.
Thank you.
And also, if you are an optimist or a pessimist about a change in the Arab world.
So, I was 26 the first time in my life to see a Jew. And I come from Damascus, so I know the Jewish quarter in Damascus deserted. The Jewish quarter in Beirut deserted. I was ashamed because I'm fearless. If I wasn't fearless, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. But I had a panic attack. I saw 4 Orthodox Jews entering the store where I rented accommodation. It happened by chance. And I shut out, I left my stuff, I left my shopping, and I ran up to my bedroom, locked the door, although nobody was following me, out of fear. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, that was the first and the last time I had a panic attack, I felt ashamed. Like it takes much more to intimidate us. Growing in the Middle East, you grow thick skin, especially as a woman. And I had to understand for myself why did this happen? And I realized the reason was I was sharing for the first time in my life the space with the Jew, with the enemy. And that is shaming. But having access to uncensored information in Europe, I could read or rediscover the history of the Middle East. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. The most interesting case I find it to be Jordan, because nobody cares that this chunk of land was given to someone, to a family coming from Hijaz. But let's leave that for a moment. These countries are new, and so is Israel. Doing my due diligence, discovering the history of our region, I was outraged. So many senseless wars could have been avoided. I spoke about my generation, my parents and their parents being traumatized by war, and the same applies to the Israelis. Unnecessary, because they didn't want to share the land with the Jews. this self-entitlement is disgusting, and it has to stop because it leads to the death of hundreds of thousands. So when I realized that my perception of the Jews was mostly shaped by the cool, the one and only Hassan Nasrallah, I was determined to try and change it, but I did it the European way. I live in Europe since 2011 now. Let's educate the Arabs about the Holocaust. Let's get them to pity the Jew, and then they will understand, give them a break for God's sake. And that's what I've done until October 7th. After October 7th, seeing the videos, and I translated most of it voluntarily. I've seen the horrors. I translated because Israelis were overwhelmed. There were so many videos recorded and shared by Hamas, their GoPro cameras, in Arabic, and everyone was trying to understand what's happening. I've seen this, and I switched to fighter mode. I will not live in a world where this is normalized. No, no, no. To add one last point, if I may, you do know that we're not allowed to visit Israel. I visited Israel 3 times since October 7th. And I can because I have a German passport. And by which I give up voluntarily, proudly, the right to return to Lebanon and Syria until these regimes are toppled. It's unbelievable. They celebrated what happened on October 7th. And their people, those who cheered on the street, they are next. And Hezbollah is showing them that. By the way, I urge you to research. It's available on Google. The video footage emerging from Gaza. Look at what Hamas are doing to Gazans. They're executing them in broad daylight because they got away with October 7th. And I have to tell you, lastly, that my experience in Israel, like I discovered Judaism, I studied Jewish studies, learned Hebrew, especially that if I can read the Hebrew Bible, I can debunk Khaled Mash'al's claim the war in Gaza is a Talmudic conspiracy. Dude, as if the Talmud is a small secret book, a scholar, a serious scholar, needs 7 years to understand the Talmud. But Khaled Mash'al knows about this conspiracy. So I learned for myself. Still, before I went to Israel the first time, I was afraid that after October 7th, they might harm me, hate me, destroy my experience. And I can tell you, now, doing what I do on social media, I'm famous in Israel. And the Israelis are big huggers. Sometimes they want a picture with me, but they all want a hug. I've never seen so much love. I've lived in 7 countries. The way the Israelis love each other. And if you come with open arms, they welcome you. And I didn't tell them that I'm a Zionist, that I support them. I always like to, it's playful. Tell them, they all want to know where you come from because of the way I look. And I tell them I'm half Syrian, half Lebanese. And they go like, whoa, what are you doing here? How did you enter? Smuggled in a tunnel.
So you gave up your citizenship, but you keep fighting, but you are a pessimist.
I am optimistic. This was, you took it out of, I am optimistic because they still gave me the benefit of the doubt. I spoke to Rawan Levy's mom. Naama, remember her name? The girl pulled by the hair with the bloody pants? This is the first person I met in Israel. And I asked her, can you ever forgive Arabs? And she told me, it's unbelievable, and this is what gives me hope. She said, what do you mean? I might never forgive the persons who did this to my daughter, but I'm a doctor, I'm a physician. I work with Arabs, I treat Arabs every day, and there's nothing to forgive. I don't know how she gets out of bed, but she finds in her heart the ability to forgive. This is why I am optimistic. Those who survived the Holocaust and went on to build a Jewish state, an admirable project to me, the most admirable, those people will not be defeated. I know we're dramatically outnumbered, but it is quality versus quantity, and we will beat them.
Thank you.
Can I get a hug?
A big hug between an Israel. Eylon, we have 5 minutes left. You'll get the current event question. I guess from your speech that you don't like a lot about the Biden plan. In some ways, I would like to know your take on this and what's going on inside the Israeli government right now.
Look, the so-called Biden plan is, in fact, the Israeli proposal. It is not a proposal that Israel is publicly taking responsibility for, and that's because there is a big gulf between the plan as President Biden presented it and Israel's declared goals of ending this war, not only with all the hostages back home, but also with the destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities. Now, the reason that we are at this point, after 8 months, where Israel may have put forward a proposal to bring back the hostages, even at the cost of ending the war and leaving Hamas standing, which is what the Biden plan seems to suggest, is that our allies lost their nerve. And that when October 7th, they lit parliament buildings around the world in the colors of the Israeli flag, they said that Hamas was sheer, pure evil. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said, "We want you to win." President Macron said, "We want you to fight terrorism without mercy." And then very quickly they discovered what it means to fight terrorism without mercy and to win against a terrorist organization that has deliberately embedded itself in civilian areas, keeps moving along with civilians, and pumping misinformation out into the world to make it impossible for the state of Israel to fight this war. And that despite Israel's superhuman efforts to innovate new ways to keep civilians safe in a fiendishly complicated urban battlefield that no army in the world has ever had to engage with, international pressure grew. Because the world lost sight of what this war is really about and what is at stake, and wanted to make it go away because it became a nuisance. And Israelis also want it to go away, but as I said, we know that if it goes away, it'll come back, and it will be worse. That is what has been happening in the last few months. The initial support that we had from the Western world and from the free world faded as people fell for Hamas propaganda and lies and fake atrocities and the twisting of international law and the emptying out of facts, to the point where the world simply wants this to go away, and Israel feels that pressure. I think it's deeply tragic that we've reached this point. I think there is so much more the world could have done to stand by Israel's side. The fact, for example, that the United States maintains its largest military base in the Middle East, in the country that still hosts the leaders of the terrorist organization that is holding 5 live American hostages, Qatar. Why has Qatar not expelled Hamas's leaders? Why is Turkey allowed to treat 1,000 wounded Hamas fighters? How did they get to medical treatment in a NATO member state? We have not had the necessary pressure on Hamas and its backers to release the hostages. We haven't had the world standing fully behind Israel. And it's a result of, I think, a certain amount of moral cowardice. Because there was a point in the middle of the war when, as an Israeli spokesman, I was having to convince Western media that their government still wanted Israel to win this war. Because they put out statements saying, we want a ceasefire. But a ceasefire can only be sustainable after Hamas will have laid down its arms. And then you say, well, who's going to make it? You and what army? What you are saying is you want a ceasefire, but there can't be a ceasefire until Israel wins. So just say it. You want Israel to win this war because you understand the stakes for the West if a terrorist organization gets away with these barbaric atrocities. But they couldn't do it. They couldn't hold the line of saying, we want Israel to win a war. They fell into a place of saying that they wanted a ceasefire. And once that became the language, it became pressure to end the war, even on terms that would not give Israel the full realization of the goals that it needs in order to maintain its security, to restore deterrence against Hamas and its terrorist armies. And I think that it's a deeply tragic indictment of the Western alliance and commitment to the right of democratic states to defend themselves against such atrocities.
Thank you, Eylon. Siamo perfettamente in tempo. Chiudiamo con Stefano Parisi che tirerà le conclusioni di questa bella serata.
No, soltanto per dirvi che più di 1500 persone ci hanno seguito in streaming, che voglio e tutti voi potete rivedere e far vedere attraverso www.7ottobre.com quello che abbiamo fatto questa sera. Vi ringraziare tutti voi, ringraziare coloro che ci hanno consentito, aiutandoci anche economicamente, di fare quello che stiamo facendo, e dirvi anche che se volete che continuiamo abbiamo bisogno del vostro aiuto, perché se pensate che questa battaglia per la comunicazione, per la verità, sia una battaglia che dobbiamo continuare a condurre, dobbiamo essere tutti insieme e rafforzare quello che stiamo facendo. Grazie veramente a tutti.
ואת מה